Before we begin, I want you to picture this. You've just finished another exhausting day at work, the kind where every hour drags, where you count down the minutes until you can finally go home. But for some people, that's when the real work begins. When the world goes to sleep, they wake up, they clean up after us, maintain the spaces we use, keep everything running while we dream. They're invisible during the day, essential at night. Tonight's story is about one such person, a man who took pride in work that nobody ever saw, who found purpose in the quiet hours when the rest of the world had moved on. But sometimes, when you spend too much time alone in empty places, you start to realize that maybe they're not as empty as they seem. This comes from a collection of testimonies gathered from workers across Japan, people who've experienced things during their night shifts that they struggle to explain. The account I'm sharing with you tonight was given by someone who knew Hajime Kuroda personally, a colleague who tried to piece together what happened during those final weeks before the school closed forever. Now you might wonder if this really happened, or if it's just another urban legend that grows in the telling. Here's what I can tell you. The school exists, or existed until recently. The records show that Hajime Kuroda worked there for over 15 years without a single incident, until suddenly he didn't show up for work one morning. Whether you believe what follows is real or not, the story has haunted everyone who worked in that building, and after tonight it might haunt you too, so settle in, because we're about to enter the world of the night shift, where the familiar becomes strange, and where being alone doesn't necessarily mean being by yourself. Hajime Kuroda had worked as a custodian for most of his adult life. At 52, he'd found a rhythm that suited him perfectly. While others rushed through crowded morning commutes and dealt with the chaos of daytime, he preferred the peace of empty buildings and the satisfaction of work done without interruption. The night shift at Nishimura High School had been his domain for the past 15 years. The school itself was unremarkable, a concrete building from the 1960s that had seen better days, 3 stories of classrooms, a gymnasium, and administrative offices that served the suburban community on Nagoya's outskirts, the kind of place where nothing particularly interesting ever happened, where students came and went without leaving much of an impression on the world. But Hajime knew every corner of that building better than he knew his own apartment. He could navigate the hallways in complete darkness, knew which floorboards creaked and which windows rattled when the wind picked up. The building had its own personality, its own moods, and after 15 years, he'd learned to read them all. His routine never varied. Clock in at 10 p.m. sharp, check the security panel, then begin his methodical circuit through the building. Start with the first floor, sweep the main hallway, empty the trash bins in each classroom, wipe down the chalkboards that still showed traces of the day's lessons. The second floor came next, then the third, though he rarely spent much time up there since several classrooms had been sealed off due to structural concerns. The work was meditative, the soft swish of his mop against the tile floors, the squeak of his cleaning cart wheels, the distant hum of the heating system. These sounds had become the soundtrack to his nights, as familiar and comforting as a lullaby. He took genuine pride in his work, knowing that when morning came, the building would be spotless and ready for another day. Most nights, the only he had was the security company guard who made his rounds every few hours, checking locks and making sure everything was secure. They'd exchange polite nods and perhaps a few words about the weather, but otherwise, Hajime was alone with his thoughts and his work. The building was scheduled to close permanently at the end of the school year. Officially, the reason given was structural concerns and declining enrollment, but Hajime suspected there was more to it. The administrators had been eager to move the remaining students to the newer facility across town, and there had been whispered conversations that stopped whenever he entered a room, Not that it mattered to him. He'd been promised a position at another school, and at his age, one building was much like another. But on this particular Tuesday night in late November, something felt different from the moment he walked through the front doors. The air seemed heavier somehow, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up. The fluorescent lights in the main hallway flickered more than usual, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Hajime had experienced odd nights before. Old buildings had their quirks, their unexplained sounds and temperature fluctuations. He'd learned not to let his imagination run away with him during the long, quiet hours. But tonight, the familiar comfort of routine felt strained, as if the building itself was holding its breath. He went through his usual preparations, checking the security panel and noting that all systems were functioning normally. The heating was set to its standard nighttime temperature, the emergency exits were secure, and the fire detection system showed no anomalies. Everything appeared to be exactly as it should be. But as he wheeled his cleaning cart down the first floor hallway, Hajime noticed something that made him pause. The staff room door was slightly ajar, which was unusual since the teachers always locked it when they left for the day. He pushed it open and flicked on the lights, scanning the room for any signs of a problem. The desks were neat, chairs pushed in properly, and the coffee maker was turned off as always. But on the whiteboard near the door, someone had written a schedule for the following day. That wasn't unusual in itself, except that under the entry for Class 2A, there was a handwritten note in red marker that simply read, "Please clean after lesson." Hajime frowned. Class 2A had been one of the sealed rooms on the second floor for the past 3 months. A crack had appeared in the ceiling during the summer, and the administration had decided it was safer to move those students to a different classroom rather than risk any structural problems. No one had taught there since August, and the room had been locked ever since. He assumed it was simply an old note that someone had forgotten to erase, though the red ink looked fresh under the fluorescent lights. Perhaps one of the teachers had been planning future room assignments and gotten confused about which classrooms were available. It happened sometimes in buildings as old as this one. After erasing the note, Hajime continued with his rounds, but the feeling of unease lingered. The building seemed to echo differently tonight, his footsteps creating strange reverberations that seemed to bounce off walls that shouldn't have been there. Several times he found himself pausing to listen, convinced he'd heard something other than his own movements, but each time, the silence returned as complete and profound as before. As he worked his way through the first floor classrooms, wiping down desks and emptying wastebaskets, Hajime noticed other small details that seemed out of place. Chalk dust on floors that should have been clean, the faint scent of fresh ink in rooms where no one had written anything for hours, chairs that seemed to have been moved slightly from their usual positions. None of these things were particularly alarming on their own. Students and teachers were human, and humans left traces of their presence behind. But taken together, they created a pattern that nagged at him, a sense that the building wasn't quite ready to settle into its nighttime stillness. When he reached the second floor, the feeling intensified. The hallway seemed longer than usual, stretching away into shadows that his flashlight couldn't quite penetrate. The sealed classrooms stood like silent sentinels along the corridor, their doors marked with official notices warning against entry due to safety concerns. But as he passed by Class 2A, Hajime could swear he heard something from inside, a soft scratching sound like chalk against a blackboard, barely audible through the thick wooden door. Hajime pressed his ear against the surface, holding his breath to listen more carefully. The sound stopped immediately, as if whoever was inside had sensed his presence. He tried the handle, knowing it would be locked, but to his surprise it turned easily in his hand. The door swung open with a slow, deliberate creak that seemed to echo far longer than it should have in the empty corridor. The classroom was exactly as he remembered it from 3 months ago. 24 desks arranged in neat rows, A's desk at the front, and a teacher blackboard that still bore the faint ghost marks of equations that had been erased but never quite disappeared. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, undisturbed by human presence. But the air smelled wrong. Instead of the musty, closed-off scent he expected, there was something else. Fresh chalk dust, the lingering aroma of ink from fountain pens, and underneath it all, the warm smell of bodies in a crowded room. It was the scent of an active classroom, but that was impossible. Hajime stepped inside, his sweeping across the desks. Several flashlight beam of them had notebooks open on their surfaces, pages covered with neat handwriting that seemed to shimmer slightly in the artificial light. He approached the nearest desk and leaned down to read what was written there. The notebook was filled with English vocabulary words, written in the careful script of a diligent student. But as his eyes focused on the text, he realized something that made his stomach clench with unease. The handwriting was identical across every page, every letter formed with mechanical precision, as if the same hand had filled every notebook in the room. He moved to another desk, then another. The same perfect handwriting, the same vocabulary words, repeated endlessly across dozens of notebooks. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. At the top of each page, in the same precise script, was a date, November 15th, 1978. That was over 40 years ago, long before this building had been converted to Nishimura High School. According to the records he'd seen in the administrative office, this had been Sakura Elementary School back then, serving the same community, but with a different student body, different teachers, different lives entirely. Hajime backed away from the desks, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. The beam of his flashlight wavered as his hands began to tremble slightly. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank, perhaps organized by students who had somehow gained access to the building. But the dust on the floor showed no footprints other than his own, and the notebooks looked genuinely aged, their pages yellowed and brittle at the edges. As he turned toward the door, preparing to leave and report this strange discovery to the security company, he heard something that froze him in place. The soft sound of breathing, not his own, coming from somewhere behind him in the room. He spun around, sweeping his flashlight across the empty desks, but the beam revealed nothing more than dust motes dancing in the air. Yet the breathing continued, slow and steady, was trying, as if someone very hard to remain undetected. "Hello?" Hajime called out, his voice sounding smaller than he intended in the enclosed space. "If someone's in here, you need to identify yourself. This area is off limits." The breathing stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. But now he could hear something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The faint scratching of chalk against the blackboard coming from directly behind him. He turned toward the front of the classroom, and his flashlight illuminated fresh writing on the board, white letters stark against the dark surface. "Welcome back, Sensei." The chalk was still rolling across the floor where it had fallen, coming to rest against his foot with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Hajime stumbled backward, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The writing hadn't been there moments ago, he was certain of that. The board had been empty, except for those faint ghost marks from months past, but now, in neat, precise characters that matched the handwriting in the notebooks, someone had written a greeting meant for him. He needed to get out of this room, out of this building, entirely. Whatever was happening here was beyond his understanding, beyond anything his 15 years of experience had prepared him to handle. He turned toward the door, but as he did, every desk in the classroom scraped against the floor in unison, the sound of wood against tile creating a harsh chorus that filled the air. When the sound faded, he looked back to see that every chair had been pulled out from its desk, angled slightly toward where he stood, as if an entire class of invisible students had just taken their seats and were waiting for their lesson to begin. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, his breath forming visible clouds in the air as the warmth was sucked away by some unseen force. The fluorescent light overhead began to flicker rapidly, casting strobing shadows that made the empty desks appear occupied for brief moments between the flashes of darkness. Hajime ran for the door, no longer caring about protocol or proper procedure. He needed to be anywhere but in this room, surrounded by the presence of students who had attended classes here decades before he'd ever set foot in the building. His footsteps echoed in the hallway as he fled toward the stairs, but behind him, he could hear the unmistakable sound of a classroom full of children beginning to recite their lessons in perfect unison. The voices followed him down the corridor, growing neither louder nor softer as he put distance between himself and room 2A. They seemed to exist in the air around him, in the walls themselves. Voices from another time that had somehow found their way into the present. By the time he reached the first floor, his legs were shaking so badly he could barely walk. He leaned against the wall outside the main office, trying to catch his breath and make sense of what he'd just experienced. The logical part of his mind insisted there had to be a rational explanation, some trick of acoustics or ventilation that had created the illusion of voices and movement. But deep down, he knew better. In 15 years of working alone in empty buildings, he'd developed an instinct for when something was genuinely wrong. Tonight, that instinct was screaming at him to leave immediately and never come back. He pulled out his phone to call the security company to report the incident and request that someone come to investigate the disturbance in room 2A. But as he scrolled through his contacts, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The time on his phone read 2:46 a.m., but that was impossible. He'd clocked in at 10 p.m. and spent no more than 2 hours making his rounds before discovering the anomaly upstairs. By his calculations, it should have been midnight at the latest, but somehow over 4 hours had passed without his awareness. Even more disturbing was the date displayed on his screen. According to his phone, it was November 15th, the same date he'd seen written in those notebooks upstairs. But he knew with absolute certainty that when he'd arrived for work, it had been November 12th. Time itself seemed to be slipping away from him, bending and warping in ways that defied all logic and reason. As he stared at his phone, trying to make sense of the impossible passage of time, Hajime heard something that made his chest tighten with dread. Footsteps directly above him, slow and deliberate, moving across the 3rd floor. But the 3rd floor had been sealed off for over a year, declared structurally unsafe after cracks appeared in the support beams. No one had keys to those rooms anymore, not even the administration. The footsteps weren't random or hurried like an intruder might make. They followed a pattern, the measured pace of someone making methodical rounds, checking each room in sequence, just like his own nightly routine, but one floor above where no one should be able to walk. Hajime forced himself to move, his legs still unsteady as he made his way toward the security office. If someone had somehow gained access to the sealed floor, the cameras would have recorded it. There had to be a logical explanation for everything he'd witnessed tonight, some reasonable cause that would restore order to his carefully structured world. The security office was located near the main entrance, a small room filled with monitors that showed feeds from cameras throughout the building. Most of the screens displayed empty hallways and classrooms exactly as they should at this hour, but as Hajime scrolled through the different camera angles, he noticed something that made his hands shake. Camera 7, which monitored the main stairwell leading to the 3rd floor, showed something that shouldn't have been possible. The heavy metal door that sealed off the upper level stood slightly ajar, darkness visible beyond the threshold. but the door had been welded shut months ago, not just locked, but permanently sealed to prevent any accidental entry into the unstable area. He switched to camera 12, positioned at the far end of the third-floor hallway. The feed was mostly static, the old equipment struggling to function in the abandoned section of the building. But through the interference, he could make out shapes moving in the corridor, shadows that seemed to glide rather than walk across the damaged floor. The timestamp in the corner of the screen showed the current time, but something was wrong with the date display. Instead of showing November 12th, the date kept flickering between different years: 1978, 1983, 1995, 2007, cycling through decades as if the cameras were somehow recording multiple time periods simultaneously. Hajime leaned closer to the monitors, his breath fogging the screens as he tried to focus on the unclear images. In camera 14, which should have shown an empty classroom on the third floor, he could make out rows of desks occupied by motionless figures, students in outdated uniforms, sitting perfectly still with their hands folded, all facing forward as if waiting for their teacher to arrive. But these weren't the current students. The uniforms were wrong, the hairstyles decades out of fashion. These were children from the building's past, when it had been Sakura Elementary School, somehow preserved in this sealed section like insects trapped in amber. The footsteps above grew louder, more insistent. Now there were multiple sets, the sound of an entire class moving in unison across the compromised floor. The ceiling began to creak ominously, dust falling from the fixtures as the old building strained under weight that shouldn't have been there. Hajime grabbed his radio to call for backup, but when he pressed the transmit button, only static emerged. The display showed no signal, as if the device had suddenly stopped functioning despite working perfectly earlier in the evening. His phone showed the same problem: no bars, no connection to the outside world. He was completely cut off, alone in a building that seemed to be slipping further away from reality with each passing moment. The familiar sounds of the heating system and electrical hum had faded, replaced by something else entirely: the soft murmur of voices, children reciting lessons in the careful sing-song rhythm of rote memorization. The voices were coming from everywhere at once, not just from above, but from the walls themselves, as if decades of accumulated learning had soaked into the very structure of the building and was now seeping back out. Mathematics tables, poetry recitations, English vocabulary words, all overlapping in a chorus of ghostly education that had never truly ended. The security footage from that night ends at 2:46 a.m. The cameras show Hajime walking down the first floor hallway, then stopping suddenly as if he's heard something. He turns toward the staircase leading to the second floor, his flashlight beam wavering. Then the feed cuts to static, and when it resumes an hour later, the building is empty except for his abandoned cleaning cart sitting in the middle of the hallway. The replacement custodian found the building exactly as Hajime would have left it after completing his rounds. Every floor swept clean, every chalkboard wiped, every light turned off. The work had been finished with the same meticulous care that had defined 15 years of night shifts, but Hajime himself was nowhere to be found. When they finally managed to cut through the welded door to the third floor, they discovered something that defied explanation. The sealed classrooms were filled with perfectly arranged desks, notebooks open to lessons that had been taught decades earlier. On every chalkboard, the same message appeared in neat, precise handwriting: "Please clean after lesson." But perhaps most disturbing was what they found in room 2A. A single name had been added to the old attendance sheet hanging by the door, written in the same red ink that Hajime had erased from the staff room whiteboard that night. At the bottom of a list of students from 1978, someone had carefully written Kuroda Hajime, present. The school closed permanently the following week, citing structural concerns that had suddenly become much more severe. The building was scheduled for demolition, but somehow that never happened. It still stands empty on the outskirts of Nagoya, waiting in the darkness for the next person who might wander too far from the world they know. Some say that if you pass by late at night, you can still see lights flickering in the windows, the soft glow of classrooms where lessons continue long after the final bell has rung. And sometimes, just sometimes, you might catch a glimpse of a familiar figure moving through the hallways with his cleaning cart, forever completing rounds that can never truly end. The story of Hajime Kuroda reminds us that some jobs require more than we ever expected to give, and that the places where we spend our lives might hold on to us longer than we ever imagined possible.